Steven is an audio engineer and RF tech, currently touring as monitor engineer for the Eli Young Band, owns and operates a small company in the Austin area focused on radio frequency services, including antenna and system design, RF coordination, consulting, and education. Holds an FCC Part 74 license, which is just a notch below 007's license to kill, amateur extra license, and is recognized by the Society of Broadcast Engineers as a certified broadcast technologist, as well as a certified radio operator. That was a lot. Hey, Steven.
I think I wrote that bio 2 years ago, and I think Nathan just teasing me with it every year.
Any new licenses we should know about?
No, not yet.
Okay, cool. Well, Steven's in the house, so I guess we're going to talk about wireless and RF. And Steven, if you're ready, the floor is yours. Take it away.
All right, let's do it. Okay. So the current topic that we're going to be talking about is understanding wireless range and gain structure. That's a topic that personally I feel is very overlooked and not talked about enough. We have a lot of discussion on frequency coordination, which is extremely important. But if you want to split a successful RF show in half, we could say that half of that success has to do with frequency coordination. The other half has to be setting up and deploying and planning your system correctly. Now, also, though, at the end of this, there should be plenty of time to answer questions on coordination, because it seemed most of the RF questions from people signing up did have coordination-based questions. So we'll have plenty of time for that. So hopefully we'll kind of hit this from all sides.
Hey, Steven, yes. Before we go ahead, just turn down your microphone just a bit.
Okay. Actually, I'm just going
to distorting a bit. Yeah.
I'm just going to lower it because I turned the interface down all the way. How's that? Is that a little better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. And actually, there's a couple of things I can do. If I need to turn it down some more, just let me know. All right. So moving on. So this is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll hit the objectives in a second, but then free space path loss is a big one. We'll talk about the gains and losses. We'll go through the link budget. We'll see some examples, and then we'll get to that Q&A section. So really what we're going to be talking about is focusing kind of on all these, can answer all these questions and focus on these, like how far should my antennas be apart? How far would this wireless device go? What happens if I add whatever device into my RF system? What happens if I take whatever device out of my RF system? Do I need a high gain antenna? And this next one is a big question. What range do I get out of whatever antenna this is? Do I need a low loss cable? Why am I getting dropouts? All these questions. These can all be answered, and you're going to hate this, in 2 words, and that's it depends. Because unfortunately, this isn't like nicely how we like at the end of a manual that's maybe a troubleshooting diagram that says, if this situation happens, then do this. There's just too many variables. And so really the objective is to provide the tools to solve any RF signal strength problem, because every situation is different. And it says here in this awesome little pop-up that we're going to take the guesswork out of RF systems. That's not necessarily true, but we're just going to learn how to take very educated guesses. And so moving on, looking directly at this highlighted portion, kind of the topic is the best way to not have a dropout is to have enough signal at the receiver. And that sounds simple enough, especially with this blanket statement up here that says everything between the transmitter and receiver will either add gain or loss, which is still pretty self-explanatory, but I cannot stress how important that is. I don't really have a good analogy for it. I guess you could say maybe in the analog days, if you had a channel insert and you had maybe a compressor and then an EQ below that, we didn't care so much about what we added. I mean, yes, you could argue the noise floor, but not in the same sense with RF. We care a lot about every little dB we add or lose. And so moving on, transmitters we're talking about with the microphones, the body packs, the IEM transmitter, and the receivers. Obviously, we're going to have our rack mount receivers and our body pack receivers for IEMs. So, and if you were this morning at Pete's presentation, he talked a little bit about intermodulation, but we can't really go farther without at least mentioning intermodulation because it has a lot to do with gain and power. And as we're talking about RF gain structure and power, obviously that falls into this category. So, and the reason that is because a lot of times when we have too much power is when we get intermodulation. And so there's a lot of talk about intermodulation, and you might have seen a diagram like this where we have two frequencies, and these two frequencies might correspond to two different microphones here. And then you'll see something like the third, fifth, or seventh, or you might see this expressed mathematically. But the way I kind of want to look at this and kind of explain it is that, okay, so actually another way is that we have mixing in nonlinear systems, and we have a lot of systems are nonlinear by nature, but others are driven into linearity by overloads. So what happens is it's not necessarily just these two carriers mixing, these two frequencies from a wireless microphone. They do mix, but their sum and difference is too far away for us to care about. For instance, if frequency 1 was 500 megahertz and frequency 2 is 505 megahertz, the sum and difference would be 1005 and 5 megahertz, which is way far away from anything we're dealing with, which would be around 500 megahertz in UHF range. However, if we have too much power, we have an RF overload, and we create a harmonic. That's the problem, because here, what this 2 times frequency 1 minus frequency 2 means is 2 times frequency 1 is the second order harmonic of frequency 1, and that's mixing with frequency 2. And that's what's creating that third order product. And we don't like the third order products because they're the highest intermodulation product and they're the closest to the carrier, which means that there's a good chance that that's going to cause interference, because that's what intermodulation distortion is to us. It's interference. And it's created by the mixing of harmonics. So if we don't have harmonics, we don't have mixing. Well, we do, but it's that frequency 1 plus frequency 2. It's far out of band. Then we don't have harmonics. Then we don't have intermodulation, and we get harmonics by a nonlinear system. We get a nonlinear system from what would have been a linear system by overdriving it. So less is more when it comes to power. Another thing I want to mention is digital systems are not immune to intermodulation. Depending on what the digital system is, it can handle it much better. Digital systems do create intermod. They create it. It's kind of in a different way. It's lower and it's wider, and they deal with it better. This next slide is kind of a demonstration of how those frequencies are mixing, something called beating. I don't know how beneficial it is to sit here and go through this. If you want to watch this, if we want to watch it, we can, or you can download it and watch it later. But basically what this is trying to show is that the mixing is actually beating. Like if you had a guitar and you're tuning on the 5th fret, those two very similar frequencies are beating, and that beat, that oscillation is what the intermodulation product is. So here to the right, we're seeing these third order products come in. And this is what it looks like in the time domain. That beating is the intermodulation harmonics creating those new products. Again, we can go back to this if we want. It's kind of, I kind of like to try and display this in the time domain, because the real world actually happens in the time domain when we like to look at the RF or the frequency domain. But basically what this is showing Oops. Okay, well, we're just going to get past that unless anyone wants to go back to that. Anyway, so moving on. So that was 2 carriers. Actually, nope. Hold on.
Stephen, it looks like your video froze. We can see your desktop, but your camera is frozen for us.
Yeah, I think those videos and that slideshow froze my Zoom. Yeah, I'm frozen for a second. But you guys can still see the screen and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll keep talking. Let me know if it completely goes away. And note to self, don't put videos and slides. All right. So what we talked about before, that was 2 frequencies mixing, but we have something called triple beats where we have 3 carriers mixing. And in the past, we talked about when the 2 carriers sum, we didn't really care because that was too far out of band. But when 3 carriers are very close to each other and they sum, that is a problem, because that harmonic or that intermodulation product happens quite close to the carrier. Yeah, no, I think my whole thing is locked up. I'm going to close this and get back into it. I will be right back, Alice.
Okay.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Nope.
Oh, you're still frozen for us, so I think it's best that you just.
Oh boy. All right. I'll be right back.
Okay, so hopefully that's going to work for Stephen. Note to all of us who are presenting anywhere, videos and slides can be problematic. Cool. I guess we'll have to wait till Stephen comes back. I think it's going to be just a minute.
All right. Am I back?
You are. We now have two of you for some reason.
Oh boy.
Maybe you can stop the screen share and see if we can get back your camera on and then see what happens there. Okay. I think we're breathing a bit easier now. We can see your camera, you're unfrozen, and the other account is gone. So let's try with the screen share again.
All right.
Step away from the videos and slides.
Yeah, I thought I got creative this time. Guess not. Okay. So going back to triple beats. So the point we're getting at, or the point I'm getting at here, we have three microphones very close together. They create all this mess. But at the same time, if we look at a situation like in your monitors where we have multiple high power transmitters going through a combiner, we don't really have that. We still have triple beats, but they're suppressed. They're not nearly as high. And that's because there's something called isolation. Every single power divider combiner has some sort of isolation in it. If we see this mini circuits guy right here, this has about 31 to 32 dB. His professional wireless systems has 20 or more. This passive power divider on the front of a Shure PA821 has isolation. A common number for isolation is about 25 to 30 dB. Now, another way of looking at isolation is saying that the signal at port 2, so if this was, we had two IEM transmitters going into this power divider, the antenna would be coming out the middle. This would be port 1 where our mouse is, and this would be port 2. So if the signal at port 2 is attenuated by 25 dB in port 1, then that's 25 dB of isolation. So attenuation can be the same thing as isolation. So if you've ever seen anyone do the demonstration where you have multiple microphones close together and they pull them apart and you see the intermod start to go away, they are actually creating isolation because of the attenuation the farther we move microphones apart because of free space path loss. Okay, free space path loss, which is this fancy formula here, is the majority of the loss you're going to see in your RF system. Antennas add gain, cables take gain away, but the biggest bulk of all the loss you're going to see is in the actual wireless link from either your microphone going to your receive antenna or from your IEM transmit going to your IEM receiver. But the good news is this is the best free attenuator you could ask for, because remember, attenuation can equal isolation. So, and I just had this discussion with someone that was saying every RF guy had a different answer for how far your antenna should be apart, whether it's X wavelengths apart or X feet or X meters. Why don't we just state that in isolation? So, and there's a reason for that we'll get to in a little bit, and that's actually pretty easy to do. So, and also, I do want to note that we're talking about transmitter to receiver antenna spacing or transmitter to transmitter spacing. We're talking about two different receive antennas. Their minimum spacing is actually dictated by the minimum spacing required for diversity reception, which would be a quarter wavelength, or we're going to be talking about field regions, which is you can't get objects super close to an antenna or you'll start decreasing its efficiency by detuning it. But if we're talking about we want to have isolation between a TX antenna to our RX antenna, we can actually calculate that out because we want, again, if we have 30 dB of isolation that allows us to have high powered systems right next to each other, then we can use that same amount of isolation with antennas. So here, let me get out of this. There's a little Excel sheet we'll be using. All right. So if we put in 512 megahertz And again, that's using the TX frequency for reference because we want the isolation from that high powered signal. So if I have, if 512 megahertz is this transmit signal, but I have a wireless mic over here at 540, we want to use the 512. So if we plug this in, so 512 megahertz at 2 feet, that's only 22 dB of isolation. So that's too close to those two antennas. So we can increase to 3 feet. That's 25. It's still a little too close. 4 feet. Nope. So 5 feet gives us 30 dB of isolation. So instead of saying X wavelength or whatever for whatever case, we can really calculate exactly what we need. And here that would be at 512 megahertz, we want 5 feet to get 30 dB of isolation. And that's going to be a pretty close number if you start moving frequency up or feet up or down. Now, when you have a large change, like down here, we have what about 214 megahertz? Because we do have like some ULXD that's down in VHF range. Now, we don't have a lot of high powered transmit down there, but there is something like Radioactive Designs, the UV1G COM does transmit high power in VHF. So let's take a look at that. So if we had 214 megahertz at 5 feet, that's only 22 dB of isolation. So that would actually be a little too close. So if we kind of just start increasing this to see if we can get to 30 dB. Oops. So that's about 12 feet. Now here's the kicker. This would be VHF to VHF. Because UHF and VHF frequencies are so far apart, the filtering will actually increase the isolation. So you wouldn't necessarily need to have 12 feet from a VHF transmit to UHF receive. But if you want to use that as a minimum spacing for good practice, that's still a good idea. Because again, the whole reason we want to separate antennas is we want to isolate those frequencies to keep them from mixing, to keep them from creating intermodulation. So again, rather than throw out wavelengths and numbers, let's just go straight to the actual number we need. And we're going to say that is greater than or equal to 30 dB of isolation. So first question down, how far should my antennas be apart? All right, so now we're going to really kind of dive into the wireless gain staging. Oh, but before here, we have some notable mentions. The first one is, so what we're looking at or talking about with the free space path loss for isolation, that is basically talking about the horizontal spacing of antennas. So what we haven't talked about or discussed is vertical spacing of antennas. And that is different. So if we're looking at, so assuming that was basically that we're talking about horizontal spacing and we're assuming that both antennas are omnidirectional. And so this up here, this Shure UA8 is omnidirectional. And if we're looking down on it, its horizontal pattern is pretty much uniform. But if we have a directional antenna, we don't have a uniform pattern. We actually have less gain on the sides. We actually have some rejection on the side, which is going to be called front to side ratio. Now, most antenna manufacturers don't give you a polar pattern or front to side ratio, but if we looked at this, and we could actually, if I zoom this polar pattern in, you can look at the pattern and zoom in. All right, I'm mumbling now. If we zoomed into this, we could actually look right here and see that's about -12. And what that would mean is if we calculated out our 30 dB isolation as 5 feet, that would actually give us about 42 dB of isolation because that formula is assuming omnidirectional antennas. Whereas because this antenna is energy focused forward, it has less energy off to the side, which means that either A, you can keep that 5 feet and have more isolation. More isolation is always better. Or you can actually shrink that distance if you need to because you actually have less signal off to that side because you have a directional antenna. The other thing we can do, which I kind of skipped around on, is the patterns are not the same for the horizontal and vertical plane. So again, looking directly down at the horizontal plane from an omnidirectional antenna, we see that uniform pattern. But if we're looking at it vertically, so looking dead on at it, we have these large nulls above and below it. Now, the problem with me telling you this is it's going to be really hard to figure out what that null actually is because there's a lot of that data isn't given to us with pro audio antenna manufacturers. But there is going to be more isolation directly above or below most of these antennas. So if you're in a tight spot and you can't get that horizontal spacing for your antenna, you could go ahead and try and put them and stack them vertically and achieve isolation that way to avoid mixing of the frequencies. And here, before we move on, same thing with this MyPro LPDA. We see the cardioid pattern for the horizontal gain. But if you look off to the side for the vertical pattern, we definitely see more rejection there. And honestly, if we got behind it and above it, we would have the most isolation due to the pattern. Okay, going on with overloads and isolation. This is digital, so this is proof that digital does create intermodulation. This is a big no-no. We do not cascade transmit combiners or antenna combiners. And this is actually a real scenario that I walked into. It was two MyPro 909. There's actually 6 of them, three per antenna combiner. The problem with this is, so in this situation, they're running at 100 milliwatts. And every time we have an active device, there is an input level that you cannot exceed. Same with passive, but it's a little more fine with active. So let's say that each one of these ports could only take in 100 milliwatts. And that's what they're given, which is fine until you take the sum of all of those and put it into the input of another device. So we're essentially giving that device 300 milliwatts of power when it only wants to see 100. And from there, we get a ton of harmonics and a ton of mixing, and a ton of intermodulation. And this is supposed to be 6 transmitters, and this is what we ended up seeing. So that is a big no-no. And the way to fix that is with isolation. You either get another antenna and you space them out accordingly, or here we didn't have another antenna and I had a power divider. So we popped that in, and then that spectrum cleaned up tremendously. And lastly, I don't know if Nathan's there, but this one's kind of for him. Do not use BNCTs. I have to fight them every chance I get on a presentation. But BNCTs have absolutely no isolation. So if we're talking
BNCs,
there he is. We're talking about them. 1, they don't have isolation. 2, if you put 2 50 ohm loads on them, it actually shifts the impedance. It's not a correct load. Do not use BNCTs for RF purposes. Okay, so back to what we're supposed to be talking about, which is the RF gain structure. I think that was actually the last of the tangents, but anyway, so where we left off is now we are experts at free space path loss. We know that our signal traveling from, let's say, microphone to receiver, we lose a significant amount of signal in free space. But we need to know more information, because if we say we lose 10 dB, that's cool. We need to know what power came out of the microphone and what our receiver can see. So the first one is easy. The RF power, especially if you have a device that has a menu on it, you can scroll through that menu and it'll tell you on power level, 10, 20, 30 milliwatts, whatever. If you have a device that doesn't have a screen on it, then the manufacturer will always specify its output power. It's an extremely important specification. Again, I can't stress how important gain structure in RF is. But here's some examples. Here's a G4 IEM. There's 10 milliwatts, 30 milliwatts, 50 milliwatts, PSM 1000, here's its output power. And there's a ULXD. Now this is all in milliwatts. We are eventually going to end up wanting this in dB, which there's a conversion up here, but we'll play with in a second. But next is kind of equally important is the sensitivity, which is what our receivers can actually see. And let's see, I have these notes of how to go about this, but first of all, the sensitivity is different per unit. As sure here is showing dBm. Here in the analog side, we see microvolt, and the quality is also important. What I mean by that is, so for this digital unit, which is ULXD, we see negative 98 dBm at 10 to the negative 5th bit error rate or bit error ratio. So it's saying at negative 98 dBm, the quality of the signal, that is what the quality of that digital signal is. It's easier to understand this in analog, and this is what I mean by that. So this EM300 G4 is an FM system, and its sensitivity is 2.5 microvolts for 52 decibels A-weighted signal to noise ratio. So if we plug in up here in this converter, there we go. If we plug in 2.5 microvolts, that equals about negative 100 dBm. So what's that saying is, if it gets an RF signal at negative 100 dBm, it's going to give us 52 dB of audio signal above the noise floor. Another way that is explained or expressed is in SINAD, which is a little bit easier to understand, because SINAD is signal plus noise and distortion over noise and distortion. But 20 dB is about 10% distortion of the signal. So if I put that in, so 2.2 microvolts, And that's given in microvolts because we're really looking at the electric field of an RF signal. That's negative, again, negative 100 dBm. So that's saying that the signal that shows up at the receiver at negative 100 dBm is going to have 10% distortion in the audio signal. So what that means is while this receiver can see that signal, it's not a great quality signal. I mean, it's probably all right, but 10% distortion isn't good, especially if we're trying to put out high quality audio. And as we're going to see in a little bit, we don't want to run signals that low anyway, because there's a lot that can happen in the path that we have to account for. So this is a good reference. We need to know what the lowest point of that receiver is, but that's not the signal we're going to strive for. And lastly, what's interesting is if we look here on this, the specifications from the ULXD, the Shure meters go from negative 90 to negative 70 dBm. But the RF overloads come on at negative 25 dBm. That is a large difference in signal of what's actually entering that receiver to what we're seeing on the RF level meter. Same with Sennheiser. Now, Sennheiser is actually in decibel microvolts, and that's already entered up here. So 40 decibel microvolts is negative 67, so about the same thing. So if we're looking at a range of negative 100 to negative 25, we're seeing full RF bars at negative 70. So there's really actually a lot going on with our signal that we're not aware of, and we're about to be aware of that. We're about to talk about what that is, because that does kind of affect everything. So let's go ahead and plug some numbers in and take a look at this. So we have our ULXD microphone, which can either be 1, 10, or 30 milliwatts. And so we'll go ahead and use 10 milliwatts, which is the easiest conversion because that's 10 dBm. And that's actually already done here. And then we have, that's already all done. Easy. Okay, so then we have, we're going to say we're at 540 megahertz and we're going 100 feet. So that path loss is 56.7 dB, which is a lot. So what that means is if we start out with 10 dBm, we end up with negative 46.7 dBm at the receiver, which is well above negative 98 dBm, which means we have a great signal. And if we're looking at our little our diagram here where we had full bars at negative 70, we're well above that. We have plenty of signal. The problem is, and as this is so colorfully lit up, that's free space path loss. And unfortunately, we're not in free space. We have all kinds of things that affect the signal. We have reflections on the ground. We have reflections in walls. We have absorption from people in the path, from instruments in the path. There's a lot that happens to our RF signal as it travels from the transmitter to the receiver. So we need to look at a couple of those things are. Here we go. Yeah, well, they're multipath fading, shadowing, and cross polarization. So multipath fading, that is simple. That is our phase cancellation. The problem is the sheer amount of it. So and again, the simplest way is we have our direct signal from the transmitter to the receiver, and then we have some reflected signal showing up at some delayed time, so it has some phase offset. Now, if you put in the perspective that RF travels at 300 million meters per second, if I have a wall over here that's 10 meters, by the time it goes 10 meters and hits that wall and reflects, it still has 299,999,990 more feet to go in that 1 second. And that could be literally millions of reflections. Now, the fact that we have free space path loss means that each time it reflects and it travels a farther distance, it's losing power. So it's probably not going to, let's say that maybe 800,000 of those reflections are not going to be powerful enough to cause a problem, but there's still a huge amount of reflections going on in RF. And these reflections, I will say it's impossible to predict unless it's a fixed link. So you could actually predict it if it's the transmitter and receiver are never going to move, but that's not the case because we have wireless microphones. We have people walking around with those all over the place. We have people with IEM packs. They're walking around all over the place. So that literally is impossible to predict. So instead, there's something called probability distribution, which is saying that there's a good likelihood that you're going to have X amount of loss due to reflections. And there's two of them that are used in RF, and that's Ricean fading and Rayleigh fading. Now, Ricean fading is saying that we have one direct line of sight or one direct path. So we have our line of sight path from the transmitter to the receiver, and then we have all the different reflections. And that's saying that there's a really good chance we're going to have a 20 dB drop at some point in our wireless link. Then there's Rayleigh fading, which is there's no direct line of sight path, which we should never be dealing with because we should always have line of sight between our transmit antenna to our receive antenna. But in the event you don't, that's saying there's a good likelihood you're going to have 40 dB of loss from all the different, because you're only having reflections hitting the antenna and then you have reflections canceling out. The other one is shadowing, and that is when you actually have an obstacle in the RF path. That can be a drum set, it could be a person, it could be a wall. There's been a lot of tests and studies done that are showing anywhere between 2 to 12 dB of loss. A lot of them will settle on 7 or 6 dB. And then on top of that, you can have body loss and absorption, which can be up to 18 dB. As we get into talking about this fading with what it means to our wireless microphone path, if you want to, one thing we can kind of look at with body loss is we could associate that with Rayleigh fading. Whereas if your body is going to be, taking up 20 dB of loss because it's blocking the path, well, then that's almost the same as there's no line of sight path to the antenna. So that could be, 40 dB of loss for Rayleigh fading, which would be a difference if you add Rician with body loss 38 versus 40. We'll get to that in a second. But so here's some real world examples. One more real world than the other. The example on the left is in my living room. This is actually the first test. This is a diversity receiver. It's recording the level over time. And so this is with line of sight to the antenna. And these little dips here, these are fades. This is most likely multipath fading because I wasn't changing the orientation of the antenna, which should be polarization fading, which we're about to talk about. But then this is with the antenna covered up. Now, this little dip here, this would be shadowing, where the actual RMS level of the RF power is just low overall, but we do see more intense fades here. Now, to the right, this is a real timeline of a Shure receiver. And if you're familiar with Shure, they have the blue lights. If the blue lights are on, then you have good signal. So here, we don't have any loss in that. But what we do see, and it's basically negative 40, 50, 60, 70, is we do see these 20 dB fades. Now, we would never notice that from the front of the receiver because that's above that negative 70 dBm mark. But the thing is, we're having massive hits to signal all the time. And it just happens. It's something that's going to happen. And if you have good enough signal, then it doesn't matter because that fade, you still have quite a bit of range above the where you're seeing full bars of RF. So that's fading. And then the last fading we're going to talk about is a polarization. So we're going to say there's two types of polarization. There's not, but we're dealing with linear polarization, which would be something like an LPDA. And then we have circular polarization. So linear polarization with the LPDA, if it's mounted vertically, it wants to see other vertically mounted antennas. If it's mounted horizontally, it wants to see other horizontally mounted antennas. If not, it's going to have quite a bit of loss. However, if we have circular polarization, it can see linear polarization in any angle. And we can try this. I'm kind of cautious about what I'm going to do to lock this up again. This is kind of a fun way of visualizing that. So here we have a helical superimposed with, let's say, a rotation for circular polarization and a dipole. Now, this is really slow, but if we sped this up, because this rotation would be at the frequency, so it'd be millions of times per second, the actual excitation of this antenna, which we're looking at the electric field, is fixed in this horizontal plane, whereas this wave, the circular polarized wave, is rotating 360 degrees. Now, that means that at the speed it's going, it spends half its time in the horizontal plane and half its time in the vertical plane, whereas the linear antenna does not. So that means we actually lose 3 dB going from linear antenna to circular antenna, but that's nothing compared to polarization mismatch loss, which we're going to see an example of that right now. As behind me is a body pack stuck to a TV antenna rotator. And then over here, I have a helical antenna and an LPDA. So we're going to rotate that 360 degrees and see what happens. All right. All right. So green is the antenna 2 is the helical, and red antenna 1 is the LPDA. All right, so I'm gonna get out of the way. So it's not gonna move very fast, but I see some excitement here in a minute. So this is one of the reasons circular polarized antennas like helicals are sought after. I don't want to say sought after, but I don't know, the buzz about helicals is cross-polarization fade or cross-polarized fades can be quite large. They can be up to 30 dB. This one, we're not seeing that, but also our antenna is like 3 feet away. So these fades are happening anytime that pack is 90 degrees in relation to the LPDA over there. So, but that's 5, 10, that's 15 dB, 5, 10, 15, maybe 13 dB there, or sorry, 17. Yeah. So, and that's kind of a, let's see, polarization demo. So what else can happen in the wireless link? We know that we have multipath fading can be up to 20 dB. We have shadowing can be up to 6 dB. We have 3 dB of cross polarization, maybe 20 dB. But no matter what we attribute this loss to, the likelihood that your signal is going to take at minimum a 20 dB hit is extremely high, and it's almost guaranteed. So that's something that absolutely keep in mind as we're going through and figuring out the gains and losses of our system. So real quick, some tips for a healthy, happy wireless link is that line of sight. Both antennas should definitely be able to see each other with minimal obstruction. Because if we have obstruction, we have shadowing, which means we have to take 6 dB out. If we don't have line of sight, that means we might have Rayleigh fading. We have 40 dB. Same polarization. We need to make sure we have the same polarizations. If not, then we could have up to, we saw 15 dB in this example here, and then keep Fresnel zones clear. So what is that? So Fresnel zone is an ellipsoidal path between the two antennas. And we've talked about this before in the past. We've talked about it mainly in the first Fresnel zone. So the first Fresnel zone, we really just want to keep clear of obstruction. We want to keep it 60% clear. But the second Fresnel zone, we want to keep 60% clear as well. But the reason that is any reflection that happens between the first and second Fresnel zone will arrive at the receiver 180 degrees out of phase. So if we can avoid that, then we can maybe avoid some of that loss due to multipath. Now that's really, no, never mind. Sorry. So we can use the Fresnel zone to predict how high the antenna is going to be. And this is hard to do with people, but if we're doing point-to-point delay links, and we can get our antenna high enough to we have no obstruction of the second Fresnel zone, then that means we can probably exclude 20 dB of multipath fading. So how far should my antenna be apart? Plus greater than or equal to 30 dB. How far will this wireless device go? It depends on path loss and fading. So moving on. Again, how far will this wireless device go? But what we've covered so far only counts for this situation with a wireless microphone and this receiver with just a whip antenna on it. We haven't accounted for something like this, where we have a remote antenna, which that remote antenna has some sort of gain, and then we have our cable, which has some sort of loss. Here we see amplifiers and antennas will add gain, everything else will add loss. So let's go ahead and figure this out. We have our power levels here we had from before. We have, let's see, 540 megahertz at 100 feet. So that path loss is 56.7. Now, all the antennas, again, you can look at the manufacturer and they're going to spec their gain. Some of them will actually have the gain printed on them. But here we can look this up and that's 6.5 dBi. For the cables, we can do it old school, or we can actually look up the exact loss. Old school would be they all have a dB per 100 dB of loss per 100 feet or per 100 meters. Generally, we have to take an average of that. So in this case, that would be 11.1 plus 8, which is 19. So divided by 2, that's about 9.5 dB loss at 100 feet. But if we say this cable is 25 feet, then we could divide that by 4. So we're going to say that this cable loss is 2.3. So if we get our calculator, all right. So we start out with 10 dB because we're going to use 10 milliwatts, and we said that 10 milliwatts is 10 dBm. And then we're going to lose 56.7 dB in path loss, but then we're going to gain 6.5 dB because we have passive gain from this antenna, but then we're going to lose 2.3 dB in the cable. We're still at negative 42 dBm, which is high. Remember, full bars is negative 70. But what if we say that we are anticipating loss? Because there's a good chance we're going to get, I mean, it's likely. It's, I'll put money on it. We're going to see at least 20 dB of loss. Whoops, that's negative 46. Wow. So many buttons I can hit at once. All right. So if we add 20 dB from multipath fading, that puts us down to negative 66, which still isn't bad. If we take away 6 for shadowing, negative 72, that's still not bad. So this is still going to be a good link. But the point is, we can keep doing this, and we're going to do this in a little bit, but we can keep adding things in, and everything is going to have an effect. Splitters and combiners will have splitter or combination loss plus insertion loss. Insertion loss is any loss in a device, usually in passive. So like in a filter, you're going to have a lot of loss outside of the passband, but in the passband, you are still going to have loss. It's a passive device. It's not one-to-one. Cables, connectors, adapters all have loss. Antennas, if they have directionality, they will add gain, or they can be close to 0 if they're omnidirectional. Now, technically, a dipole has 2.15 dBi of gain, but sometimes we're talking about dipoles that are not actually wideband dipoles, like the Shure UA8. It may be a lowered efficiency if it's not if it's not dead center of where this actual antenna's response is. You may not have 2.15 dB of gain. Then we have active combiners and distros. And these are mostly unity gain devices, which means they have amplification to compensate for the combiner loss. So these generally, if we were adding these into our system, we'll say they're not going to change anything at all. If they do, it's plus or minus 2 dB. They're not purposely adding gain or taking it away. Amplifiers obviously will increase the gain. But we need to be careful with these. These should really only be used for compensation, just like in unity gain combiners, because they will raise the noise floor and they can cause some intermodulation products. So let's talk about link budgets. So this is where we bring everything together that we've talked about to figure out if our system will work, why our system had a dropout, if there's a problem. We're bringing it all together here. And the simplest way to put this is the received power equals the transmitted power plus gains minus losses. And if we want to elaborate on this, that's the received power equals the transmitted power, and that's going to be in dBm. The gain of the transmitted antenna, and that's going to be in dBi. If you see this spec'd in dBd, their RF venue does spec their antennas in dBd. You actually need to add 2.15 dBi to that to get its dBi. Then we're going to have transmitter losses. This would be cables between the antenna and the transmitter. This would be passive splitters. This could be filters. You can filter a transmitter output. But then we have free space path loss, which we know about. Then we add up our miscellaneous losses, which would be fading. Then we have the receiver gains, which could be antenna, passive antenna gain, or amplifiers, or losses. So let's go ahead and just start working on this instead of me just yelling about it. All right. So in this situation here, we have a Shure PSM 1000. We're going to say it's at 482 megahertz, and it's at 100 milliwatts. And then what's going on with our hardware is we have a jumper that's going into a combiner, and then that combiner is another jumper that's going into the passive divider that's going through a cable that's going to a helical antenna. So let's take a look at this to see if this will work, to see if this is good, to see if this is healthy. I'm going to go ahead and just pull this spreadsheet up. So first of all, we have 100 milliwatts, and 100 milliwatts is 20 dBm. So let me go ahead and do this. So we have 20 dB, and that's the power of the transmitter. Then we need to look at our let's see, we're not going to get transmitter gains yet, transmitter losses. So we have a jumper cable here. Jumper cables pretty much are going to be between 0.7 and 1.5 dB. The tricky thing is that when you start looking at cable loss calculators, they're calculating the actual raw cable when it was brand new, and they're not accounting for any kind of wear and tear or if the connector wasn't installed incredibly. So we'll go ahead and add in 1.5. So if we want to actually add that here, we can say, just for reference. Okay. So we come out of the transmitter, we have our jumper that's a loss. We're going into a unity gain combiner. So we're going to assume that has no effect. It's not supposed to. Then we're going to hit another jumper. So that's going to be negative 1.5 again. And then we're going into this passive power divider. Now, any two-way split is going to be a 3 dB loss plus some insertion loss. I don't remember if Shure has the loss spec on this. We can actually look it up real quick. Oh, sorry, PA821. There, the system gain is plus or minus 5 dB. Okay, wow. Expansion port. So they're not actually going to tell us. But again, any two-way division, we lose half the power, and since it's a power ratio that's 3 dB. So we can go ahead and use 3.5 because there will be some insertion loss there. Then we need to figure out the cable loss here. This is an RG58 cable. RG58 would be the low loss, and this is 10 feet. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use this RF cable calculator that Professional Wireless Systems has, and there's a link to this in this PowerPoint. But let's go ahead and scroll to RG8. And we are at 482 megahertz and 10 feet. So that's saying 0.47 dB. Now, the one thing I will say about, again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, most of these cable calculators are looking at the cable brand new and sometimes without connectors. So honestly, if it's that type of calculator, I'll add 1 dB. So we're going to do 1.47. Okay, and then we get into the helical antenna. This is spec'd at 10 to 12 dB of gain. We'll use 10 for worst case scenario. And then we briefly talked about this, but circular to linear polarization is a 3 dB mismatch. So that's -3. So that's all of our transmitter gains and losses. Then we need to look at our free space path loss. So, and that's already there. 482 megahertz at 20 feet is -41.8. So we're going to add this up before we add any kind of fading or miscellaneous losses and see what we get. Okay. So 20 minus 1.5 minus 1.5 minus 3.5 minus 1.47 plus 10 minus 3 minus 41.8. So after all of that, even after losing half of our power through this power divider here, we're still basically in RF overload territory. Two things to note from that. One, 100 milliwatts is a lot. RF less is more, especially when we're talking about intermodulation. If we overload this pack, then we create those harmonics, then we create intermodulation problems. The other thing is we actually haven't taken into account the fading. Now, again, fading is a probability and it doesn't happen consistently. So even if we threw 20 dB of fading in there and got -42 dB as our result, that's still not happening all the time. So and we're not having those 20 dB fades are going to be instantaneous and random. So we're still, with fading thrown in here, we're still overloading this receiver. So through this link budget, through calculating the gains and losses, we need to lower the output power of this, which is easy to do because these go to 10, 50, and 100 milliwatts. So that's one way to use path loss. Another is this example. This is actually from Shure. I didn't make this, I just threw some numbers in here. But here's an interesting one. So let's say this is a conference and you're trying to use high density, which is really low power. This is Axion Digital, so the high density mode is 2 milliwatts. Does this system work if you're designing this? Well, we can figure that out with our link budget. So the two ways we're going to look at this is we're going to look at this with low loss and with not low loss cable. One's going to be RG8X, which is pretty similar to, let's say, like an RF venue type cable, or some of the cables that Shure sends out with the systems. Not the ones, not the rack jumpers. Those are usually a 5.8. And then we're going to look at it with an LMR 400, which is a low loss cable. So first of all, we need to figure out path loss at negative 84. We're saying this is 584.225 megahertz. So let's do 584.225, and that's 84 feet. So that's going to be 55.9. dB of loss. And then we have that 2 milliwatts. So let's go ahead and put 2 milliwatts in here. That is 3 dBm. So I'll go ahead and start writing that down. So our transmitter power is 3 dBm. We don't have any transmitter losses here because it's coming straight from wireless microphone. So we're going to put down just our negative 55.9 at path loss, and then we get to the receive side. So again, we can throw 2.15 dBi in here for the gain of this antenna because it is a dipole. A lot of times it depends on which frequency you're in, and there's not a good way of knowing that. So we can actually go ahead and leave this at 0. So we're gonna go straight to our cable loss, which we're gonna say is 100 feet at RG8X, and that's about 584. 584, 100 feet. And RG8X. That's 9.84 dB of loss. So minus 9.84. And then we go into a splitter. So we're going to lose. We can actually look this up. Now, this is a little odd. It actually shows 2 dB of insertion loss when you look up the UA221, but that is not accounting for 3 dB of splitter loss. So that's actually going to be negative 5 dB. And then we need to look at our 10-foot cable. Which is going to be 0.98. And then for right now, let's not add the amplifier. Let's go ahead and see what our loss is, and then we can add that in a second. So that would mean we go back to another minus 9.84 dB of loss from that cable. So let's go ahead and add that up. All right, 3 minus 55.9 minus 9.84 minus 5 minus 0.98 minus 9.84. That gives us negative 78.5, which is good until we account for some losses. So if we said negative 6 dB for shadowing, negative 20, that puts us at negative 104. That means we have absolutely no room for error. So that first number of negative 78 looked great because remember, we have full RF bars around negative 70. So we might have, we'll have a little bit of loss there, but we can make up for that with this amplifier, which can go from 6 to 12 dB. So if we add 12 dB back, is that 105 or 103? Anybody remember?
I think it was 104 point something.
Perfect. So we'll say 104. If we add 12 dB to it, whoops, that's at negative 92, which is still really not comfortable, especially, and actually if the Axion's negative 98 dBm. So that's not going to work. We're running it way too low because if you remember the sensitivity, yes, it can see that signal, but that's not a good quality signal that low. So let's go ahead, and the first thing we can try and do is change these to low loss. 100 feet is a pretty long run of RF cable. So let's go ahead and try that. So again, we have our 3 dB coming from the transmitter, and then we have our 55.9 dB of path loss. And then we need to go through here and figure out our new cable loss. We're just going to change this to that LMR 400 at 100. And that gives us 3.08 dB of loss. That's a lot better. Now we can also do this, like I said before, I normally add 1 dB into this, and I didn't on the last example. So we can go ahead and make that minus 4 dB because cable calculators are usually, they give you a little bit too good of an answer. It doesn't reflect the real world. So that 10 foot's negative 0.3. Okay. So here's that 100-foot section. Then we have our negative 5 dB of the UA221, then that negative 0.3. Then we are going to be, well, let's try it without the amplifier again. So then we're just going to go straight to our other 100-foot section of cable, which should be negative 4. All right. 3 minus 55.9 minus 4 minus 5 minus 0.3 minus 4. That gives us negative 66. And then if we add in our 12 dB from the amplifier, negative 54. We're in a much better spot because now if we throw in our 20 dB of fading, which is pretty much going to happen, that negative 74, that means we almost have full RF bars. So we have some wiggle room. So that answers that question of, do I need low loss? Well, it depends. It depends on what, also depends on the budget because low loss cable is a lot more expensive, but it depends on what your system's gain and losses are. Now, this is still running it a little close because that, yeah, we have that 20 dB fade we added in there. We didn't add in shadowing, which would bring it to negative 80. So we still don't have a large margin to play with. I would say that high density is pushing it for this size space. But again, it's adding up all these gains and losses can tell us so much about what we can anticipate is going to happen. And again, you can reverse engineer and say, well, I had a dropout. Why? If you know the signal level, the distance, you can figure out whether or not that should have worked. Even if you throw in all of the fading and you still should have had a good signal, then maybe there's something wrong with your system. So you can learn so much about your system and how it's going to work and plan. And this is really how you plan for a system with path loss. And there's 2 more examples we can work. I'm not sure what timing is because I still want to get to other questions. I
think we're good.
Okay. How's everyone feel about this so far? Are we learning something? Is this kind of is this going fast? Is this stuff we already knew? How do we feel about this information?
I do have a question from Gabriel who wants to know, how do you compensate for unknown frequencies being coordinated at the last minute? Because right now you're using the frequency that you know is going to be used in that particular moment or in that particular space. But how do you sort of account for, what might happen?
Use the highest frequency that's going to be there because you're going to have the most loss in the highest frequency. So let's say that you have, so if you're designing the system, it's going to be harder to say that a random frequency is going to show up. But let's say that you know it's going to be, let's say, Axion Digital, which has a wide tuning range. At least in the United States, it tunes to what we have left. So you at least know that there's some high point. You know that this is the highest frequency we can legally operate in. This is the highest frequency this device can tune to. You're always looking for worst case scenarios, and the highest frequency is going to give you the most loss. So you're going to shoot for that.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So, 2 more examples, and then we're going to get into the answering some of the questions, which will bring us to some frequency coordination stuff. So here's a current project that is going on. We've only gotten into minor testing, but basically there's an event where it's a balloon, a hot air balloon race, I think. Anyway, there has to be delay towers, wireless hops. And one of these delay towers is 400 feet away. The next one is 300 feet away. So we're trying to figure out, is this possible? And this is the prime example of why you do these link budgets and these calculations. So the gear that's going to be on hand is Sennheiser G3 IAM and band G. And that's 566-608. We're going to choose 607. And the reason is channel 37 begins at 608, and that is an unused channel. Pete Erskine was talking about that a little bit this morning. But since nothing really is in channel 37, you're guaranteed to have some quiet spectrum if you nose up to that channel. So we're going to choose 607.225 megahertz. We know that our first, we have 20 feet going to the first antenna, which is a helical 9 dBIC. That means dBi circular, which means we have to take 3 dB off of that to get it to linear. Because here's the question: can we do this with just a G3 pack on the other end mounted high in a stand, or do we need to have a wireless microphone receiver there with another antenna with gain going into that? The only downside there audio-wise would be that would have to be a mono signal if we go into a mic receiver, but we might need that extra gain to make the RF signal work without issue, because 400 feet is a long hop. So let's go ahead and start plugging some of this stuff in. And we're going to look at this in two ways, with the receiver mount on the stand and then with the LPDA and the extra cable. So Sennheiser G3, that is 30 milliwatts. That is the output power it can handle. So let's dump that in here. 30 milliwatts, that's 14.7 dBm. So that's what we're starting with. Okay. Then we need to go through a cable to an antenna. That cable is 20 feet LMR 240. Let's see, 240. And then what I say, we're at 607.225. And it's 20 feet. Okay. That's actually kind of close. This cable I actually know is more of 1.7 dB. And so if you can measure your cable, it's always going to give you a better result, but you can get close to these calculators. And that's why I said I like to add a dB or so for worst case scenario. So going with that, let's just go ahead and do 2.24. So we're going to minus 2.24 for cable loss. And then we're going into a helical antenna. That's plus 9 dB, but we're losing 3 dB of that from polarization mismatch. So now we need to figure out our free space path loss at 400 feet. So frequency 607.225. 400 feet. So we lose 69.8 dB. Okay, so at this point, we're going to see just what we've got, what we're working with, because we want to see if we can make this work with just the G3 receiver body pack mounted high up on a stand, because that doesn't have any kind of receiver gain. So let's go ahead and work that. All right, so 14.7 minus 2.24 plus 9 minus 3 minus 69.8. That's not bad, negative 51.34 dB. Now, we haven't added any fading, but here's where we can use that free space, or sorry, that Fresnel zone clearance. So the antenna height we know is going to be 14 feet, and that's actually going to be on a lighting stand. I believe the Manfrotto stands, which are pretty popular, only go to 12 feet. So let's go ahead and look at our Fresnel zone. So, oh, there, it's already there. Okay. Our distance, so our first Fresnel zone can be 12 feet. Like I said, the longer the path, the larger that, the maximum clearance, the larger that radius is going to be. So our maximum clearance has to be a little larger. But to make sure we don't have anyone in the path, we have to keep 7 feet of that clear. Now we have a 14-foot high antenna, or the antenna is 14 feet high. So 14 minus 7.6 is 6.4. The average tall person is probably 6'2", 6'3". So we can make a reasonable assumption that we're not going to have a person in the first Fresnel zone, which means we don't have to take away that 6 dB of shadowing. Okay. So that's great, because we kind of need everything we can get for that long hop. The next thing is we need to make sure we don't have a reflection on the second Fresnel zone. And that's 10.7 feet. The main reflection we're going to be seeing off of that is maybe ground or vehicle. That's going to be hard to predict. If we're only concerned with the ground and we know for a fact there's not going to be anything driving through there that could cause a reflection, I would say 10 feet is fine because we have 14 feet. So we shouldn't have to worry about a full reflection. But because we don't know, we should go ahead and throw in 20 dB. And I just messed that up. All right, so I think that was negative 51. Let me go ahead and add that up again real quick. 14.7 minus 2.24 plus 9 minus 3 minus 69.8. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and add that 20 dB for multipath, and negative 71, that's pretty close. Okay, now I tested this on a G2 receiver that I brought out one day. This antenna was not as high, and I got 129 meters, which is about 430 feet, and I had full bars. And the reason for that is our first calculation came back at negative 51. Now, the Sennheiser G2 is 20 milliwatts, so we actually lost some power there. But because fading is instantaneous and not constant, and this particular time, I had full bars because there's no fade. Now, if I walked forward about 5 feet, it did drop to about halfway through. But also where I'm at, I have less power with the G2. I'm also in a position where I'm not 14 feet high, so I do have path loss from shadowing and multipath fading. But this link will happen. This link will work. Especially we have that height, which is a huge factor, and we have the power. This is going to work. And at that point, if it doesn't, since it's a fixed link, move it 5 feet and get it out of that multipath cancellation, and then you should be fine. This event is not happening yet, but there's going to be a full scale test coming up, but that's where we're at with that one. And then lastly, actually there's 2 more we can do real quick. This one was actually rather surprising. I do the coordination for one of the churches in town, and I got a call that they had interference from one of their side buildings, and what they thought was a microphone from the main theater, I guess if you want to call it that, which I thought was not possible because it was an SLX that was another building away. Basically, well, actually, let's work it out and see, is that possible? So the distance between these 2 buildings is about 87 meters. And the actual frequency was 582.259. So let's start plugging this in. Oh, it's already there. Okay. So all right, 30 milliwatts is 14.7. And then our path loss for 87 meters at that frequency was 66.54. It was a whip, so we're going to say that there was no receiver gain really. There would have been a jumper though, because it did go through a distro. So from the distro, because the whip was directly on the distro, which actually would be 2 jumpers because they had the, no, I'm trying to remember. Okay, we're going to say it wasn't. So there's going to be 1 jumper there. So say 1.5. And let's see what that is. So 14.7 minus 66.5 minus 1.5 is negative 53. But we have no line of sight. So that's going to be Rayleigh fading. So we're going to say we have negative 40 dB. And then on top of that, we're going to say we have shadowing because we do. There's multiple walls, interior and exterior walls going on here that this RF signal is passing through. So that's about negative 99. So is that possible? Well, I don't know. We have to look at the sensitivity of the receiver. So if we look up Shure SLX receiver, manual. Sensitivity is actually 105 dBm per 12 dB SINAD. Remember, that's not a great signal, but that makes a lot of sense because they thought they heard a signal from the main building, but it was kind of distorted. And that actually was the case. So it turns out that there wasn't supposed to be any J3 in that room. They just found a receiver and turned it on and brought it into the room and plugged it in. That was the issue. But I was actually pretty perplexed that an SLX could do that. And that's 30 milliwatts. Again, RF power goes a lot farther than you think it does. But yeah, and then the last thing I would say that you could play with is the 8-way divider takes 10 dB out, is 10 dB of loss. And you could look this spec up, but I was going into a situation that had 8 PSM 900s, and I wanted to see if I could get away with using this because this is $72. And if you have a PSM 900, the reason I said that is that's 100 milliwatts, which is 20 dBm. So the 3 settings on that are 10, 50, and 100 milliwatts. And 10 milliwatts is 10 dBm. 100 milliwatts is 20. So if I bumped all those up to 100 milliwatts and put them through an 8-channel passive divider, and I lost 10 dB, then my output is essentially 10 milliwatts. So I'm kind of back to where I started if I wanted low power. So yeah, that absolutely is possible. And that's $72 versus like $5,000 for an active distro or combiner. So you can learn, again, the things you can figure out with your RF system by running these path loss calculations just are endless. And it's just extremely helpful. So that pretty much answers all these questions and then some. And how do I need this? Because I love what range will I get out of this antenna. Well, it doesn't work that way. It depends on what the gain of your system is and what that antenna is adding or taking away from it, as is the same answer for what if I add this or take this away from my system. And now we did it kind of individually by looking at the different aspects that affect loss, but there are purpose-built calculators that do this for us. And here's a couple links to some. One of the areas that we were playing around in was the RF portal from Professional Wireless Systems. I was showing that for cable loss, but they also have a path loss calculator in there. If you go to calculator, it's not as in-depth, but it'll do all that for you. And the other one, Clean Wireless Audio, this is a much more in-depth path loss calculator that you can use. Okay, so if we're good on that, I'd like to move on to questions that were submitted to try and cover all that stuff while we still have some time. How does everybody feel on RF system gain and the losses that happen before we move on? All right.
No questions in the chat, except if those calculators that you were using in your Excel sheet will be available to us later on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not, that was pretty much it, but I'll definitely include this with the slideshow and all that. So it just has the free space path loss up here, then all the different power conversions, then Fresnel zone and field regions, which we didn't really talk about field region. If we have time, we can show a demonstration of it. But again, you don't want to get things very close to your antenna or you'll change its performance. Okay, so get into some of the questions. One of them is, how do you deal with RF frequency coordination at a festival site? So this depends if you are the RF coordinator of the festival or if you're walking into a festival and there's no RF coordinator. There's a couple ways to approach this. If one of the ones that I walk into a lot is if you show up to a festival and let's say that you're not with the headlining act and there is no RF coordinator, what do you do then? Because then it's pretty much a free-for-all. And so we can look at this actually in 2 different programs. I'm going to show on IS real quick. It's a little faster for me to do it that way. So let's say we show up to a festival and the headliner is already maybe sound checking, you're setting up your monitor world. Well, one of the good things would be to ask him if he's planning on powering off his RF or if he's going to leave things on. But regardless, the more people you can be coordinated with, the better. So in that situation, we're going to want to pull their frequencies in and lock them. So if I showed up and so-and-so is the headliner, maybe we're direct support, and he's got a bunch of, let's give him Sennheiser. He's got a bunch of Sennheiser 2000 stuff. For IAS, we'd come in and just start entering in his frequencies manually. And let's see that one, maybe he has a 518. And then we'd start pulling all those frequencies over. Get this out of here. Once those frequencies are over, then we would go ahead and lock those frequencies. And then we would move on to whatever else he has. Maybe he has some Axient. Or no, he has ULXD. Let's do that. And he's got this. So once I pull all of his frequencies over and I lock all of them, go ahead and say, then we can start coordinating our gear. And that way, no matter what happens, if he powers on, or maybe one of his guitar techs or something powers on RF during our show, my show, whatever it is, we're not going to be affected by that. Because if there's not a frequency coordinator telling someone to turn on or stay off or turn off, who knows what's going to be turned on. So find everything you can, enter it in your coordination, lock it, and then coordinate yourself around them. That way you're protected for anything that comes on that's supposed to be there. I mean, if someone just brings something in randomly, that's always the fight that, regardless of your position on the show side, it's going to be hard to deal with unless you can locate them and either coordinate them or have them turn off. But so that would be the way to do it there. Workbench, almost the exact same thing. So I would go in. So let's say the headliner had Sennheiser. He had 2000. So I would bring that in and I would enter in the frequency that he had. Sure. Let's say he had that. Okay, and then we would lock that and then we'd coordinate around him, but same concept. If I was the RF frequency coordinator for a festival, the biggest thing you can do is get information. Get what the house has. If the house has any RF, chances are the PM of the festival or whoever is planning it has some sort of house wireless that, or maybe is advanced if there's someone coming in, it has a fly date type show. Or if there's an MC mic that has to be on through all acts, get what the house RF is, and then make sure someone is reaching out, if it's not you, to figure out what all the bands are bringing in. Figure out the type, the quantity of it in the band, because things like Axiom Digital do scan through what's left, at least in the United States, but other things are still limited in bands. So if it's PSM 1000, what band is it? And figure out everything you have. And then from there, dump it all in and see if it'll work, because chances are you're going to have to create multiple show pages. And so what I mean by that is if you have a lot of your spectrum is eaten up and you can't fit every single band in there, you're going to want to try and fit bands that are consecutive in the same page. Sometimes that doesn't work at all either. So you have to do one page per band. So if I did my scan, so let's say that's my RF spectrum. So let's say it's a more intense spectrum. Okay, so band 1 has all of this UHFR H4, and if I can't fit anything else in that, so well, let's say band 1 is all coordinated, but I can't fit band 2 in, then I have to create a whole new show file. I would have to save this, wipe this stuff out, leave. I would leave in all of my exclusions in here. And let's say if this was the house, then we'd keep the house RF there. But if I could fit another band, then I would do that. So let's take out half of these. this would be band 1. Okay. So the more acts that we can fit in one coordination page, the less we have to go around and make sure who's powered on and who's powered off. Because if this band was about to finish and go into band 2, these two bands are coordinated with each other, so they can turn off and turn on somewhat at leisure. But if we couldn't fit both of these bands in the same page, so I just had band 1, and then I have to open up my coordination page for the next one, then I have to go and make sure that when the band that's on is done, everything gets powered off as fast as possible, which is easy to do with if you're in monitor world. But then if you have to run around and find wireless mics and find wireless guitar packs, that can be problematic. So on a festival, you want to get as much information as you can to start pre-coordinating, and then try and fit as many bands together as possible. And now if there's more bands in this, then if we had if we're working with, let's say this is tight spectrum again, and we're going into band 3, then the next coordination page we load might be let's say whatever RF this was, and then band 2, band 3. And then the next page would be band 3, band 4. So we're fitting those bands in by just not having the other bands RF in there, if that makes sense. The other thing is when you start coordinating, you always want to do things with triple beats first, because those take up the most space. So that means you're going to want to coordinate IEMs first. Triple beats are the 3TX thirds and wireless workbench. Be the 3T3O, I believe. 3T3O. So you will fit more frequencies if you group those channels. So if I had, let's go ahead and wipe this out in IIS. So my thirds are on. If I go to an IEM system, it's going to create a lot of transmit thirds. If I group that together, whereas I try and get pretty much these, let's see if I had 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's see if I can get 8 in one channel. And each time you calculate, it actually starts with a random number, so you'll get different different outcomes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes. Okay. Now, and this will make more sense if I turn this on in the graph. Okay. So the red is TX thirds and triple beats. So when I keep all those IEM transmitters, which are created with triple beats close together, then I keep all these triple beats kind of contained and close together. If I spread them out, then I would have high powered transmit thirds and triple beats kind of spread throughout the spectrum. So one of the things when you start coordinating is to always coordinate with your transmitters first. And by that, I mean high-powered transmitters like IEM, used to be COM. We don't really have that anymore. And keep them grouped together. And then from there, you can go on with your wireless microphones. So those are kind of what I would say to deal with a festival. Everybody good on that? Awesome. All right. RF coordination, spectrum management tips and tricks. And then taking measurements from external analyzers into something like wireless workbench. Nathan, is that a hand raised? Or are you saying hello?
Yeah, but I didn't need to interrupt. Do you want to?
Oh, no, you're good.
Sweet. Okay, yeah. Since you were talking about the link budget, I wanted to ask about unknown cable brand and model. So a lot of times I do just one-offs freelance where maybe I'll see an equipment list that has the microphone brand and model and maybe the antenna as well. And I feel like that gets me a lot of the way there for the information that I need, but it doesn't include, a lot of times it's not going to include the cable. And I could follow up and ask that, but I'm just wondering, do you feel like it's worth the time to go through and run a couple different scenarios with a couple different kinds of cables just to have an idea, or if it's such a big change depending on what the cable is?
Sure. Yeah, and because we didn't mention it, but I mean, aside from free space path loss, long cable runs are usually going to be your second biggest, second biggest cause of loss. So yeah, if you don't know what you're going to run into, then going down to the smaller. When I say smaller, I mean smaller diameter. The smaller the diameter, the more the loss. Now, the three common ones, if you're looking at the RG, the radio grade, radio guide, however you want to go about that, 5.8U is, or 5.8 is going to be one of the smaller cables, and we don't see that often. It's generally going to be pretty much an RG8X and RG8. And from there, they're all going to be kind of similar as long as they're 50 ohm. And if you really want to dig into that, if you don't know the, so now, are you also asking about if you show up and you don't know what the cable is, it doesn't tell you what it is to figure out what kind of loss it is, or just in advance?
Only ahead of time in advance.
Yeah. Then yeah, run the 8X. I doubt you're going to see 5.8 again. So yeah, try with 8X, see what happens, just to see how much room you have, because it's possible that, again, we're talking about a probable loss. And so that 20 dB is probably going to happen. More loss than that, maybe. It's possible, depending on things like, do you have direct line of sight? So if you are running that and you're really riding on the edge of the lower loss cable, that maybe that means that we have to be really, really cautious with antenna placement. But it's these decisions we can find out through that. But yeah, I would definitely run multiple calculations for that, because we're always going for worst case scenario. I guess pretty much in life too. Okay. So,
hey, Stephen, on the topic of cables,
yes.
Gabriel wants to know if what kind of cable test equipment do you recommend or use?
Yeah. So really, the best way to test a cable is for loss. So anything that's going to send a known signal, and they can measure that known signal without damage. So that can be, and we've looked at that before with taking an IEM transmitter with some attenuators into an RF Explorer, just to make sure we know what that is. But and then there are things like the Nano VNA, which is like a $50 piece of test equipment that will send a signal out through the cable and then look at it on the other side. And that will tell us the loss. And I can put a link to that, or we can put a link to that. But that's basically what that is a network analyzer. But in some spectrum analyzers have they can output a signal. On top of that, that's the best way to measure, because you want to know the loss anyway. Like I kind of mentioned, we were talking about the delay hop. I actually know what that specific cable loss is. I made the cable and measured it. So that's, if you have something on hand like that, that can be very valuable instead of making these assumptions through cable calculators. But then if you want to go farther than that, you can get something called a TDR, where you'll actually send a pulse down a line. But for most of what we're doing, you want to look at the loss through the cable, and really anything that can send a signal that the output power of, and then a way to receive that. But what I'm basically describing is a network analyzer, and you can get the $50 one, the Nano VNA, and test cables all day long. And we can look at that today. Well, I don't have the Nano VNA hooked up, but I do have a VNA hooked up if you want to plug a cable into it and see what happens. Another thing we could look at is actually port-to-port isolation. There's a couple other demos, sort of, if we want to look at those just for fun, if we have time. But actually, here's another question that somebody put up that I can answer really quick. What is the most foolproof method of setting all my wireless frequencies? One thing I cannot stress enough is that we use some sort of frequency coordination software. The receivers can scan and they can find frequencies in their banks. The one thing they can't do is figure out where they are in the world. And that's especially important in the United States and Pete mentioned this, the T-band stuff, which is 4-15, hold on. Some of the channels in the United States are used for public safety, and most likely a receiver, and that's walkie-talkies, it's two-way radio. So they're not transmitting constantly. So there's a good chance that if you did a scan and your receiver said this channel's clean, but then someone keys a radio, that channel's not clean. And the only way we really have a good idea of what that is to know where we are in the world and to have that information. And anytime you do a database search, in Wireless Workbench. If you're over here in Spectrum and you search TV channels, or if you're in IAS and you do the TV Data Wizard, that will tell you if you have public safety channels. The other thing is if you have any kind of mixing of brands, you have to do an actual coordination with software. I just went out with an artist that did not ever do that, and they were wondering why they had massive RF hits. And we went through all their gear. All their gear was operating fine. There was no problems with the cables. The hardware side was good. The issue was they weren't coordinating correctly. They were just turning things on and scanning, and then that didn't work because, one, you're not coordinating from intermod between each one of those devices unless you're all in the same bank or same groups, which they weren't. And also they were just kind of scanning randomly, but taught them how to actually set up and do frequency coordination. They haven't had a dropout since. I cannot stress enough how important actual frequency coordination with software is, rather than just scanning with the gear. That's the most foolproof method to set up. Now, spectrum management and monitoring tips. What I like to do is if I have a spectrum analyzer, depending on how fast it is, if it's a slow spectrum analyzer, it's not sweeping very quickly, just monitor the ears because you can't really see that signal level. Whereas on Wireless Workbench or Wireless System Management, you can constantly monitor the RF level meters, which are around -70 dBm, remember? So we can constantly monitor that if we're networked into them, but we can't really see the RF signal and what's going to happen to that with IEM systems. So if you have a spectrum analyzer, I like to monitor IEM transmit, and then on the actual interface for the software, like Wireless Workbench, monitor the receive. Taking measurements from external analyzers into something like Wireless Workbench. That is much easier to do now because the new version of Wireless Workbench that came out can take all kinds of scan formats. Before, it had to be from a spectrum analyzer or a CSV file from a spectrum analyzer. There was basically frequency and then the power level. And so you could rearrange some of those, but now Wireless Workbench takes pretty much all of that. It actually even takes Sennheiser. And there was a discussion about this on Sound Design Live earlier, and I actually tried it the other day. This is a Sennheiser scan, and it just pops right into Wireless Workbench, which is fantastic because those scans were actually pretty difficult because they were arranged in not a way that's easy to deal with. Whereas other spectrum analyzers, you could delete a column in Excel and then import it into frequency coordination software. Let's see. I think that's kind of it for the the questions that were submitted in advance. How are we doing on time, and how do we feel about everything? How do we feel about life?
Life is good. We still have about 13 minutes, and we have a question from Kim. Kim, if you want to unmute yourself and ask Stephen your question.
Yeah, I was just going to elaborate on the TV channel, public safety channel thing. So when we're putting in our zip code or whatever, how can we know? Because sometimes I put in TV channels and the spectrum looks totally clear. How is there any way for me to know, like, this is a public safety channel or this is just a TV channel that's super far away?
It should tell you in the database. So let's try. Hold on, I gotta find Dallas. I know there's one there. Because yeah, in the actual spectrum, it'll just look like a TV channel, and if you don't see it and you want to unblock it, that can be a problem. Let me pull up a zip code real quick.
Yeah, because the temptation is always like when half the spectrum is red. If it looks clean, you just want to ignore it, huh?
Oh yeah, and those are the ones that you can't. All right, 1 second. Okay, 75237. So right here, yeah, it should tell you when you bring it in. It says public, yeah, you have to see it here, public safety. That's the only way you're going to see it, because once you import it, there's no way of knowing. So you have to check this. Same with IAS. If I did a TV data search. Actually, I'm sorry. IIS, I think blocks it out. I don't remember. Yeah. Okay. So IIS does block it out. It makes it unusable spectrum, that pink. But wireless workbench, you just have to pay attention to when you do a channel search. You got to scroll through the list and see what it is. That's channel 16. So I guess just make a mental note. But that would be a good thing to, I guess, email Sure about and say, hey, maybe in the future, let's make that more obvious. That's public safety. That's a good point.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, so we actually, if we want to talk about isolation, I have something that's kind of cool we can look at as a demo, because I know demos are fun. If the questions are clear right now.
Yeah, we can do that. Go ahead.
All right. So have you ever heard that and when you're wiring up a combiner to skip a port, so if you have transmitter 1, 2, that should be port 1 and port 3 to increase isolation? Yeah. Well, you want to see that in real life? No, Nathan? Okay.
No, I'm saying I haven't seen it, but yes, I want to see it.
All right. Well, let me get rid of all this. If I could figure out how to do that. Okay. All right. So there's actually two things I want to show us about power dividers. The first one, we're going to look at that port-to-port isolation. And so the way we do that is I'm going to put a load on the actual sum port to this. And then I'm first going to plug in. So this is 1 through 8. I'm going to put in the adjacent ports. And if we remember, let me actually close this right now. If we remember this little picture from the beginning, these 8-channel antenna combiners are just a lot of small two-way power dividers. So what we're doing is we're saying that if we have 2 ports that are close together, we'll get more isolation if we have, I guess, let me backtrack. So let's say transmitter 1 and transmitter 2 have consecutive frequencies. So if I had 500 and 501, it would be better to take that transmitter that has 501 and put it farther away to get more isolation than have it on this pair. And so we do increase isolation. We don't do it like each one of these is about 25 to 30 dB. That doesn't mean we have 30, 60, 90 dB, but we do increase isolation and we can see that. Okay. So, and this is a network analyzer. This is what we're talking about how to test cables with. I'm going to take this cable, which is sending a signal into this port, and I'm going to pick it up from the other side to see how much port-to-port isolation I have from adjacent channels. Let me go ahead and start this. What we're looking at, this bottom line here is the actual signal coming back. So again, this is 8 channel. Sorry, can't think right now. This is an 8-channel divider. So that's -11. Oops, that's not right. So this is adjacent ports is showing 11 dB of isolation, which something is wrong there. But if I go to another port, I have 34, which is correct. Let's see, that's 32. That's that adjacent port. Yeah, let me try and change this load. Basically, the way these passive power dividers work is they have to have a 50 ohm load on either side. If they don't, you have a massive mismatch and you have a reflection and you have loss. So the problem is if I had an 8-channel passive divider like this and I only needed 4 of them, I would have to terminate 4 ports. And I was going to show us that, but I don't know if I can. You know, if the demo is actually all worked out.
Honestly, we're still all amazed with the rotating antenna. I didn't understand what was happening at first. And then I zoomed in on your video, and then I think Lou nominated you for some kind of special award. I can't remember what happened, but a lot of emotions.
For the coolest.
Yeah.
Well, so what's really interesting about that is that's a crude way of testing what's called axial ratio. So not all circular polarized antennas are created equal, or more so, not all circular polarization is circular. So technically, as you're rotating through that, you shouldn't have any change. And if you do, then you actually have closer to elliptical polarization. But that is actually a crude way of testing axial ratio. But it also works if you want to look at, you know, sending a linear polarized antenna around and seeing what circular polarization does to that.
Awesome. Well, this has been really great, and we have to get you out of here so we can get Nathan in here. So let's let Alish take over. But sorry, what were
Thank
you
you,
going
guys.
to say?
I was saying thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for this great presentation, and we all learned something new. Stick around if you can for a few minutes. Let's see if people have other questions that they can post in the chat, and you can answer them there. And we will be, I guess, jumping into the next presentation. I think Nathan is already here. Nathan, you will take over, and then we can figure out how to call you guys without creating massive confusion and universal vortex of just exploding things. So there we go. Thanks, Stephen. And
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen.
welcome, Nathan.